For the new year, I still live, I still think, I still have to live, for I still have to think. Sum ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. Today, everybody permits himself the expression of his wish and his dearest thought. Hence I too shall say what it is that I wish from myself today, and what was the first thought to run across my heart this year. What thought shall be for me the reason, warranty, and sweetness of my life henceforth. I want to learn to see more and more as beautiful what is necessary in things. Then I shall be one of those who makes things beautiful. Amor fati, let that be my love henceforth. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. Looking away shall be my only negation. And all in all, and on the whole, someday I wish to be only a yes-sayer. End quote. In the year 1885, Friedrich Nietzsche made a rather unusual purchase, a headstone for his father, Carl Ludwig Nietzsche. That may not sound at the outset like such an unusual thing for someone to purchase, until we consider that Carl Ludwig had been the Lutheran pastor of the small town of Röcken, just outside of Leipzig, where the young Friedrich Nietzsche had grown up. He died at the age of 36, when Friedrich Nietzsche was only 5 years old. Now, given what most people know about Nietzsche and about the philosopher that he would grow to become, and that he certainly was by the year 1885, that's why the purchase may seem a bit unusual, because what do most people know about Nietzsche? That he was an anti-Christian, he was an immoralist, he was a man who considered himself set apart from the Germans, from the rural folk, from the Lutherans. And seemingly his father could be seen as the symbol for all of those things. But as we'll see, that was not the case for Nietzsche. And in fact, understanding his decision to purchase this headstone will take us right into the heart of his philosophy. And you could even say that we find this headstone, this monument for his deceased father, right at the intersection, the crossroads of Nietzsche's life and his philosophical thought. As my main source, I'm drawing on the work of Charlie Hoyneman, a professor at the University of Utah, whose essay Nietzsche's Task first made me aware of the headstone. Hoyneman has also published a book on Nietzsche entitled Genius of the Heart, which explicates Nietzsche's entire philosophy in the context of his life, and which I warmly recommend to all of you. I'm going to draw on his essay Nietzsche's Task, however, because this headstone is the center of that essay, and it's rarely the center of attention when people talk about Nietzsche. And in fact, the headstone is probably unknown to most people who have not looked deeply into the details of Nietzsche's life. It's usually left out of most introductions to Nietzsche's work. It's not mentioned at all in Kaufmann's book on Nietzsche, for example. And for my other sources, just to give credit, though, I will draw upon the biographical information found in the work of Kaufmann, as well as Curtis Cate and the medical research of Leonard Sachs. Now, as mentioned, Nietzsche purchased the headstone in 1885. That was the year that Nietzsche finished Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he writes of in his autobiographical work Ecce Homo, as well as in his letters to his friends, as being his magnum opus, and even a turning point in the history of world philosophy, and a turning point for himself that divides his own earlier writings from what he considered the mature period of his philosophy. 1885 was the year that he'd finished Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He'd written it over the course of 1883 to 1885, and he also published the first volume of the work. And so the release of the first part was really only the beginning, but he could see that we might say the wheels were in motion for him. But Nietzsche had a problem at this time. His publisher badly mishandled the first volume of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And while this publisher had apparently had very little problem in churning out hundreds of thousands of anti-Semitic tracts and Christian hymnals, they had stalled on the printing of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and they'd been negligent in selling the book. Only the most insistent buyers had been able to place orders. Nietzsche wanted to be free from his publisher so that they didn't mishandle the following 3 volumes of his great work. And so Nietzsche sued his publisher, and he won. Consequently, Nietzsche was released from his agreement with them, but furthermore, he was awarded a settlement, and with that money, Nietzsche bought the new headstone for his father that we mentioned. It was inscribed with the phrase, Die Liebe höret nimmer auf, which translates to love never faileth. That's a quote from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and the headstone was to be placed in the graveyard in the small town of Rücken, which Nietzsche had not seen since his youth. In Heunemann's essay, he writes, quote, "The purchase of the headstone raises a variety of interesting questions. First, in less than 3 years after this date, Nietzsche would be writing his Antichrist, one of the most important and caustic criticisms of Christianity ever written. But how can the tone of that work square with the pious devotion of the headstone? Second, Nietzsche barely knew his father. He had a few memories, some fond, and some no doubt of the painful agony and madness suffered by his father just before he died. Why should this need to memorialize him arise over 3 decades later? Moreover, the type of man his father was, a country pastor of a rural Lutheran church, was a type he would regularly ridicule in various works with great severity. Christian, pious, rural, German. And finally, the stone was going to his childhood home, placed in a cemetery he never wished to see again. Nietzsche never had money to waste. Why then did he spend such a considerable sum on a distant monument to the father he hardly knew, a father with whom he seemed to have so many deep and irreconcilable differences?" End quote. These are not easy questions to answer if you only have a cursory understanding of Nietzsche's life. So we're going to go back and explore the details of his biography if we wish to comprehend the headstone's significance. We'll return to the very beginning, even before the beginning of Nietzsche's life. Nietzsche's father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was born in 1813. That is the same year that Richard Wagner was born, who later became a friend and patron and arguably father figure to Friedrich Nietzsche. Karl Ludwig studied theology and then worked as a tutor for the princesses at the court of the Duke in Altenburg. In 1842, at the order of King Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia, he assumed the pastorship of the village of Rücken and moved into the rectory there, together with his mother and 2 unmarried sisters. He met his wife, Franziska, Nietzsche's mother, through another pastor of whom she was the daughter. Apparently, Nietzsche's father impressed Franziska and her family with his piano improvisations, and as many of you know, Friedrich Nietzsche was also fond of improvising on the piano, just as his father was. A year into the marriage of Karl Ludwig and Franziska, their son was born, whom they named Friedrich Wilhelm, because Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on the birthday of the reigning king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, and Pastor Karl, Nietzsche's benefactor as well. In Nietzsche's youth memoirs, Mein Leben, which he wrote when he was 14, he described his father as, quote, "the very picture of a country parson," end quote. Karl was a cheerful and gentle man who was well loved by his community. Nietzsche's mother, his aunts, and the other villagers believed that Karl Ludwig knew the true meaning of Christian love, and they told the young Nietzsche as much when he was a boy. As a boy, Friedrich Nietzsche was considered a wunderkind when it came to theology. He mastered it at a young age. He even knew all the hymns to a degree that greatly impressed his father. The Nietzsche family soon had a daughter, who was Friedrich Nietzsche's younger sister, Elizabeth, and then a second boy was born, Karl Ludwig Joseph Nietzsche. But the family's happiness was not to last. In 1848, Karl Ludwig had a fall, and then was incapacitated by painful cramping and became bedridden. No one knew the cause. The attending doctor described his condition as liquefaction of the brain, and this has led to speculation that the cause was a stroke. He died after weeks of severe agony in 1849, when Friedrich Nietzsche was 5 years old, and less than a year later, Nietzsche's younger brother, who was less than 2 years old, had severe cramps and also died. After these 2 traumatic deaths in the Nietzsche family, young Friedrich recorded a dream in his journals, in which his father rose from the dead, and he came like a revenant into the household and claimed his younger brother, then returned to the cemetery with him and took him down into the grave. The dream may have been prophetic in a way. Based on the available evidence, researchers in the present day have suggested that there may have been a connection, perhaps an inherited illness in the Nietzsche family, And it is worth noting that when he grew into adulthood, Nietzsche came to believe this. The dream of his father's ghost claiming his brother seemed to symbolize this in some way, that the fate of the son was tied to their father. And just as little Carl Ludwig Joseph was claimed by the same curse, that curse may one day come for Friedrich Nietzsche himself. What effect might it have had on the young Nietzsche to see this man, his father, the exemplar of Christian love, tortured and broken by a horrendous and inexplicable illness? Nietzsche had, in so many words, a crash course in the problem of evil at the age of 5. A horrific and meaningless thing happening to a good person, with seemingly no justification even possible to make sense of it. Nietzsche himself would write in his preface to his Genealogy of Morals that he was fascinated with the problem of evil from an early age, and that, when he was very young, he attributed the cause of evil to God himself. Perhaps the realization dawned on him that there was, as I said, a meaninglessness to his father's death that didn't quite match with the Christian explanation of suffering in the world, that perhaps there was an indifference to nature itself. Nietzsche's early life involves the haunting specter of this illness, and Nietzsche's own affliction, which may have been related to his father's, began in the years that followed. He had his first migraine at the age of 9. It would take longer for other more severe symptoms to develop, such as stomach pains, nausea, sometimes bouts of vomiting. His migraines seemed to be connected with the gradual loss of Nietzsche's vision, which would also worsen over the years, and the eventual appearance of visual phosphenes, twirling lights and colors that he saw when he closed his eyes. In spite of this mysterious affliction, the young Nietzsche attended the prestigious boarding school of Schulpforta in 1857. A number of famous alumni received their primary schooling there at an institution that was respected going back centuries. These include the philosopher Fichte, the historian Ranke, and many others. It was there that Nietzsche first discovered the world of ancient Greek heroes, Greek dramas and plays and tragedy, the Olympians and their myths. The Greeks absolutely enchanted the young Nietzsche. There he also met fellow student Paul Deussen. They befriended one another over their mutual love of the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. Apparently Nietzsche found a copy of World as Will and Representation in the library, and Schopenhauer's atheistic pessimism completely changed his outlook on the world. Another important influence in the juvenile thought of Nietzsche was David Strauss, who was an infamous critic of Christianity. When Nietzsche returned home during the holidays, his mother and aunts soon found that Nietzsche was a changed man. He no longer wished to take communion, and he now understood Jesus not as a God incarnate, but as a living man, a historical phenomenon. While his family was horrified by this, one of his aunts rationalized the matter by suggesting that all the great theologians had their crises of faith, and that this was simply a natural step on the young Nietzsche's intellectual and spiritual journey. Little did they know that Nietzsche was rapidly losing interest in theology, and perhaps owing to his enchantment with the Greeks, he was soon to choose the life instead of a classicist. Nietzsche eventually attended college at Leipzig. This is from Heunemann's essay. Quote, "By this time he regarded himself as practically freed from the religion of his father. By 1861 he had stopped attending church services with his family. He was now drawn to the world of Greek heroes and great philosophers. He studied classical languages and texts, and Hegel. He was already reading translations of the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he was lit afire by Schopenhauer. He worked endlessly to hone his own writing style, so that his writing would be like improvisation at the piano, quote, as free as possible, yet still logical and beautiful, end quote." And that quotation at the end is from a letter to Nietzsche's friend Karl von Gersdorff. When Nietzsche began his university career, he immediately impressed the faculty, particularly the men who would become his mentors, Otto Jahn and Friedrich Wilhelm Ritschl. They were both somewhat legendary professors of philology. Philology at this time is part and parcel with the study of the classics and with Greek and Latin society and culture. But more broadly, philology is the study of the structure of language, the relationship of concepts in language, the relationship of language to culture. Nietzsche had the privilege to study under two of the best philologists, although Jan and Ritschl did have their own disagreements, which would eventually worsen into a split that would happen later on. Nietzsche impressed Friedrich Ritschl so much that Ritschl recommended him for a professorship, which Nietzsche would eventually take at the University of Basel, without even having to pass a final examination. This was at the unprecedented young age of 24. Ritschl described Nietzsche in this letter of recommendation to the faculty at Basel, quote, "However many young talents I have seen develop under my eyes for 39 years now, never yet have I known a young man, or tried to help one along in my field as best I could, who was so mature as early and as young as this Nietzsche." His museum articles he wrote in the second and third year of his triennium. He is the first from whom I have ever accepted any contribution at all while he was still a student. If, God grant, he lives long enough, I prophesy that he will one day stand in the front rank of German philology. He is now 24 years old, strong, vigorous, healthy, courageous physically and morally, so constituted as to impress those of a similar nature. On top of that, he possesses the enviable gift of presenting ideas, talking freely, as calmly as he speaks, skillfully and clearly. He is the idol and, without wishing it, the leader of the whole younger generation of philologists here in Leipzig, who, and they are rather numerous, cannot wait to hear him as a lecturer. You will say I describe a phenomenon. Well, that is just what he is, and at the same time pleasant and modest. Also a gifted musician, which is irrelevant here. Nietzsche is not at all a specifically political nature. He may have, in general, on the whole, some sympathy for the growing greatness of Germany, but like myself, no special fondness for Prussianism. Yet he has vivid feeling for free civic and spiritual development, and thus certainly a heart for your Swiss institutions and way of living. What more am I to say? His studies so far have been weighted toward the history of Greek literature, of course including critical and exegetical treatment of the authors, with special emphasis, it seems to me, on the history of Greek philosophy. But I have not the least doubt that, if confronted by a practical demand, with his great gifts, he will work in other fields with the best of success. He will simply be able to do anything he wants to do." End quote. As is commonly known, Nietzsche did end up moving into other fields than philology, clearly, and so Ritschl was correct about Nietzsche's many talents. At the same time, his prediction that he would, or his prophecy that Nietzsche would set the world of philology on fire, turned out to be somewhat incorrect. It was this same year in 1868 that Nietzsche met Richard Wagner, the composer. Wagner was famous in his own lifetime, and he had created an entire cultural movement in Germany around his music, and the circumstances behind the meeting between the young Nietzsche and Richard Wagner involved Friedrich Ritschl's wife. She happened to be friends with Wagner's sister, and while Richard Wagner was visiting with them, Nietzsche came up in conversation, and Ritschl's wife mentioned she'd actually heard one of Wagner's compositions played before by the young Nietzsche on the piano, and so Richard Wagner asked to meet this young man. And upon their very first meeting, they became fast friends. Wagner very much enjoyed receiving praise and admiration from his fans, and Nietzsche was a great fan of Wagner's work. He was positively starstruck to meet him. Further, the two men found that they shared a love for Schopenhauer's philosophy, and after a long and involved conversation, Richard Wagner and his wife Cosima invited Friedrich Nietzsche to visit them again. At this time, the couple lived at Triebschen on Lake Lucerne, which was a short train ride from Nietzsche's post at Basel University, and he would visit them dozens of times over the next handful of years. Heunemann writes, quote, "Wagner seemed to Nietzsche to be exactly what Schopenhauer had defined as genius. Wagner presented a new world of possibilities, themes, and ideas that would never be reached by mole-like scholars digging after the worms and bugs in ancient texts and tomes. Nietzsche by this time wanted to be a cultural hero, not a mere scholar, and Wagner's world spoke to him of heroic possibility." End quote. As mentioned, Nietzsche's own father would have been the same age as Wagner had he lived, and the two settled comfortably into the relationship of mentor and admirer. Nietzsche appreciated Wagner's cultural project of rejuvenating the German psyche, of a rebirth of German art and culture. And the pagan elements of Wagner's operas reached back into the imagery of the hero Siegfried and the Valkyries and Wotan, these stories and characters that are at the root of Indo-European mythology. This all seemed to Nietzsche to be the proper raw material for this cultural rejuvenation because it offered something which predated the Christian view of the world. That is why this is often called a romantic period in Nietzsche's thought. And that label of romanticism certainly characterizes his first book, written while teaching at the University of Basel. It was entitled The Birth of Tragedy and was published in 1872. Nietzsche himself tells us that its first scribblings were authored directly after his military service during the Franco-Prussian War, which was actually a very hard time for the young Nietzsche. He had been injured while doing his mandatory military training when he was much younger and had fallen off of a horse while attempting to mount it. Even though apparently Nietzsche was a very good writer, he had this accident and this injury to his chest, which exacerbated many of the problems with his illness that we mentioned before. And so when the Franco-Prussian War broke out, which lasted just under a year, Nietzsche served as a medical orderly. And as soon as he was done with his service there, he was discharged after bouts of illness that were apparently quite hard on him. He went and spent Christmas with the Wagners, and he delivered to them his first ever edition of The Birth of Tragedy. And it exemplifies this period of Nietzsche's thought. It's romantic, it's Schopenhauerian, and it is Wagnerian, openly Wagnerian. Now, in this book, Nietzsche took a stand against some of the prevailing ideas about the Greeks that were widely accepted in the academy at this time. For one, the idea that the Hellenic Greeks were a cheerful and naive people. In other words, that they were something like the noble savages of Rousseau's imagination, or that they possessed, as Winckelmann put it, a noble simplicity, or an idyllic calmness, or serene cheerfulness in their greatness. These viewpoints were found across the German classicist world, again in Winckelmann, Goethe, Nietzsche would later mention Christian Lubeck, and many others. Now, Nietzsche believed, on the contrary, that the Greeks of antiquity were a healthier society than the Germany of his own time, and that this health did not consist in naivete or simplicity, but in excess, in what he would later openly say was a form of savagery. Certainly the Greeks were more natural, but this means that they were closer to the natural cruelty of the tiger, not to some infantilized version of natural man, portrayed as peaceful and harmless, as though the natural man were Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And Nietzsche believed that the refutation of this idea of Greek cheerfulness was the centrality of Greek tragedy, in which the Greek culture depicts suffering, mortality, failure, death, betrayal, incest, family committing, matricide and patricide and so on. And it represents all of these things on stage and nevertheless constitutes a kind of celebration of life. And how could this be? Well, Nietzsche would argue in a later preface that he appended to Birth of Tragedy, trying to explain his earlier thought in light of his later mature thought, that he saw the Greek society and their predilection with tragedy as a, quote, neurosis of the healthy. Now, further, contrary to the assessments of types like Lubeck, Lubeck was a classicist who had argued that the Greek rituals had no meaning. They were simply a primitive form of entertainment. Nietzsche held that the Greeks had a complex and deep cultural tradition that was built into these rituals, and that part of the problem with the German culture attempting to understand the Greeks was because in so many words, they're barbarians. Nietzsche believed that his own German culture could not be considered an improvement or more advanced simply because it occurred at a later point in time. And Nietzsche raises the possibility that perhaps our own modern society is a degeneration in respect to, considered in respect to the Greeks. Now, Nietzsche's implicit critique of modernity and Birth of Tragedy is tied to his critique of Socrates, whom he calls the mystagogue of science, the man who ushers in the theoretical worldview. Whereas the attitude of the Greeks prior to this was tragic, Socrates introduces a new way of living based on reason, morality, and optimism. Nietzsche rejected the idea that optimism was a healthy symptom for a culture. Rather, Nietzsche says that the Greeks represented through tragedy a, quote, pessimism of strength, which means the embrace of a cruel world and a limited human condition. Not just the passive acceptance of the suffering of the human condition, but the celebration of it and the apotheosis of it even. So the Greek gods live and suffer in the world just as human beings do. And Nietzsche argues, thus do the Olympians justify this world. Quote, they themselves live it, which is the only satisfying theodicy, end quote. Now, a theodicy is the term in Christian apologetics for an argument created to answer the problem of evil. And again, if we consider that Nietzsche had a brush with the problem of evil as a child, this can help elucidate why Nietzsche transitioned from his Christian upbringing to an identification with the ancient Greeks. He finds the Greek worldview and their exaltation of tragedy to be a more acceptable answer to the problem of suffering than the Christian view, that the sufferers in this world will be rewarded so long as they remain faithful in an afterlife. That might constitute the otherworldly view of Christianity. The Greeks, on the other hand, affirmed this life while simultaneously taking a pessimistic, harsh view of the world, but still saying life is good. As we all know, the famous story of Achilles encountered by Odysseus in the underworld. No winning words about death to me, Odysseus. I would rather be a laborer on a farm, tilling the fields somewhere, just to enjoy a fresh breath of air and sunshine, the joys of being alive once again. So, in any case, as you may have gathered from all of these things that Nietzsche, these arguments that he advances in Birth of Tragedy, this work did not set the world of German philology on fire. Several prominent figures like Ulrich Williamowitz Moellendorff attacked the work for its lack of citations and its unorthodox approach to the discipline. And really, this work has one foot in philology and the other in philosophy. Nietzsche is as much analyzing Greek drama as he is trying to comprehend the way in which we have used art and religion to make sense of the human condition. And notably, he says in Birth of Tragedy that, quote, only as an aesthetic phenomenon is life eternally justified, end quote. So we have in this formulation the shift from a Christian worldview to the pre-Christian, pagan, Greek worldview, rather than a religious or metaphysical justification for the world and its suffering, which means a justification which appeals to another world, some other dominant reality, which is posited as a true world. Nietzsche looks instead for an artistic justification to life, which means a redemption in the world of appearances, not behind appearances, but in the appearance itself. And he finds this in Greek tragedy. The world of philology was not ready for this kind of analysis, and perhaps they were right to criticize Nietzsche for the book. As Nietzsche would later admit, Birth of Tragedy has its flaws, and much of Nietzsche's philosophical analysis is simply a recapitulation to the work of Schopenhauer, and the last handful of chapters involve a not-so-thinly veiled celebration of the music of Wagner. In fact, Nietzsche had intended this book to be a statement on behalf of the aesthetic movement of Wagner, and Wagner himself wrote a piece attacking Williamowitz Moellendorff for his essay that critiqued Nietzsche's book. In other words, Wagner came to Nietzsche's public defense over the Birth of Tragedy, and he may not have been the best defender to come to Nietzsche's aid, as his apologetics for Nietzsche served more than anything to establish that Nietzsche was Wagner's philosophical representative. And Walter Kaufmann, Nietzsche's translator, commented on this. He argues that the third and final part of the book is little more than unfortunate hero worship. Kaufmann writes, quote, for Wagner, who had many detractors, it was nice to have a brilliant young professor as an ally, and when The Birth of Tragedy appeared, he wrote to Nietzsche, I have never yet read anything more beautiful than your book. What he liked best, of course, was the worst part of the book, the lengthy part with its effusive appreciation of Wagner. Nor did he have anything but praise for those stylistic qualities which Nietzsche himself later criticized in his preface to the edition of 1886, end quote. One of the reasons why I wanted to focus in on this early period of Nietzsche's philosophical thought is because it intersects with the period in which Wagner became that sort of surrogate father figure for Nietzsche. Again, the same age as Carl Ludwig, and again, a kind of authority and mentor. And notice that Nietzsche, when he was a boy, was being steered by the logic of his family. I mean, he's the son of a pastor and the daughter of a pastor. And everyone in his family expects him to go into theology. That's what a bright young man such as Nietzsche, coming from that family, would naturally be expected to do. And when Nietzsche, after his early crash course of the problem of evil, where he sees the meaningless suffering and death of his father, and perhaps is sort of knocked off center by that, and then he has those mind-opening experiences at school, meeting Paul Deussen, the Schopenhauerian, reading Schopenhauer, reading David Strauss, sort of feeling as though he's left the religion of his father. But he then attaches onto a different religion, so to speak. He attaches onto, we might say, the cultural movement of Wagner, but more broadly he becomes enthralled with the Greeks, enthralled with, in so many words, Romanticism. And Wagner becomes the father figure of Nietzsche's elective life path and his elective life philosophy. So Nietzsche has diverged from what had been chosen for him, from the father that was set by biology and by the life path that was set by the circumstances of his family and his birth. And he's chosen philology and classicism, and he's chosen Schopenhauerian philosophy, and he's chosen the music of Wagner and his cultural movement, and accordingly he's chosen Wagner as a new father. But that all is very important to understand in light of what comes after this in Nietzsche's life, because he followed up his effort in Birth of Tragedy with a number of essays, which are called the Untimely Meditations, and he intended these as cultural commentary. And this is where Nietzsche begins to experiment a bit, and he becomes explicitly philosophical in nature. He was still teaching at the university at this time, but his personal interest had begun to shift from philology to philosophy. He'd always had an interest in the Greek philosophers, particularly the pre-Socratics, and Socrates, even though it's a critical interest in him, plays a central role in Birth of Tragedy. And eventually he began to explore the possibility of changing his discipline to philosophy and joining the philosophy department at Basel, but the university never approved his request. And in the latter years of his tenure at the university, his eyesight began to fail him, and his ability to even function as a professor began to become impaired. And soon Nietzsche's relationship with Wagner became strained, and there were several reasons for this. For one, Nietzsche had become uncomfortable with the personality cult that had sprung up around Wagner. In the town of Bayreuth, the annual Wagnerian festival took place. It still takes place to this day, by the way, and a Wagnerian newsletter was published there. So he was sort of centering Bayreuth as this new sort of capital of the Wagnerian cultural movement. And Nietzsche was a part of the reason why Wagner was living at Triebschen is because they were constructing a new festival opera house at Bayreuth. Nietzsche was actually there when they laid the foundation stones for the new Festspielhaus. And those 3 years in which the Wagners lived close enough to Nietzsche at Triebschen that he could visit them by a short train ride, was all sort of the build-up to them relocating to Bayreuth. And so, in 1886, when the first festival is finally held, Nietzsche attends, but he finds he doesn't have the time of his life that perhaps he was expecting. He felt alienated from the types of people that attended the festival. He found them small-minded, nationalistic, religious, and sycophantic. It reminds me of an incident I didn't really mention, but when Nietzsche attempted to join a fraternity when he first went to the University of Leipzig, he found that his fraternity brothers expressed a kind of what he described as beer-drinking patriotism. And if you know 2 facts about Nietzsche, it's that he had disdain for patriotism as much as he did for beer drinking. And he found them to be rather plebeian types, and I can only imagine that many of the Wagnerians who showed up at the first festival were probably reminded him of those types of people. And Nietzsche began to worry that the Wagnerians would begin to influence Wagner. We call that audience capture in the modern day. and that rather than Wagner reshaping the German psyche would begin to reshape Wagner. And indeed, Nietzsche believed that Wagner's operas had begun to reflect Christian themes. Nietzsche writes of the various reasons which led to a schism between the two men. But there are three big points of disagreement. First, that Wagner capitulated to anti-Semitism. That was very common among the German nationalists, and German nationalism was Wagner's second strike with Nietzsche. He said that he could not forgive Wagner because he became Reichsdeutsch. And finally, Wagner, as Nietzsche wrote, eventually collapsed, quote, helpless and broken before the Christian cross, end quote. And he says, Richard Wagner, who seemed all-conquering, turned out to just be a helpless and despairing romantic. And that might be a bit puzzling as well, because it seems that Nietzsche himself was a romantic at this time. But he would later repudiate the romanticism of Schopenhauer and Wagner in a passage in The Gay Science. And his later explanation was that he didn't really fully realize at the time what romanticism was, and he began to see a connection between that so-called pagan romanticism of the earlier Wagner, reaching back to the imagery of Siegfried and Woden and so on and so forth. But he began to see a connection between that and the romanticism that spilled forth into Christianity. That the common thread between the two of them was a dissatisfaction with modernity, but a sort of longing for a release from the stress and tension. In the Christianity, it's the Sabbath of Sabbaths, but in pagan romanticism, it's perhaps the idealization around a more natural and therefore more fulfilling way of life that mankind once had but has been taken away from him. Again, within the pagan romanticism, usually it's not this cheerful, naive, Rousseauian form, but nevertheless, even that reaching backward, thinking that we can return to an earlier era, thinking that it was easier for mankind or better for mankind before the Industrial Revolution and before all of these modern developments, Nietzsche comes to recognize even that as sort of a path to, or rather than a path, expressing the same underlying weariness for the world that Christianity does. In any case, this trifecta of anti-Semitism, German nationalism, and Christianity, Christian romanticism, this trifecta represents sort of everything that Nietzsche saw Wagner becoming or recognized Wagner for being, and it was everything that he considered boorish and herdish and overall foolish. And, you could see it as Wagner became consumed by a crowd of volkish rabble that he'd fostered into a personality cult, but which actually consumed him. Now, of course, there are other theories about the split between Nietzsche and Wagner. Some believe that Nietzsche had unrequited affections for Wagner's wife, or that Richard Wagner inadvertently spread a nasty rumor about Nietzsche, that his illness was tied to excessive masturbation. The details of this are explored in another episode of the Nietzsche podcast, the two-part episode on Wagner. But the short answer is we will never really know if there was actually some personal dispute between the two men in addition to the ideological. And furthermore, we should point out when the couple left Triebschen and moved to Bayreuth, soon Wagner, the great man, was no longer a short distance from Nietzsche. He, at the festival, surrounded himself with royalty and other famous artists and celebrities, and it may have been the case that Wagner was perhaps didn't feel as accessible and as close to the young Nietzsche as he had felt before. So at the festival, Nietzsche has this experience of alienation, and furthermore, he has an onset of his illness, his migraines, his headaches. He says he has to listen to the Meistersinger while sitting in a dark room, and all of the smells and scents and overspiced food and beer drinking and loud noises. He leaves Bayreuth in a bout of sickness. He then betook himself to a small town by the woods, and disappointed with Wagner and with his Wagnerians, he began writing the first draft of a new book. Instead of drawing upon German thinkers for inspiration, he had grown fond of the French philosophers, Voltaire, Chamfort, La Rochefoucauld, and so on. Nietzsche's ideas shifted. He became less interested in the project of finding a cultural hero. Arguably, the archetype of the hero was still important to Nietzsche, but perhaps the emphasis we should place on cultural. He became less interested in finding a cultural hero. And he began to analyze philosophical ideas and values and religious traditions as natural phenomena, as things that emerge from a psychological origin, and therefore from a physiological origin, due to natural conditions such as geography and climate and all of the demands that might be placed upon a people or a culture in order to survive. And all of these cultural structures of metaphysical grounding, all of these value systems were relative to one's time and place. And most importantly, relative to the necessity that was behind their creation. This simply could not fit with Wagner's ideology, which had moved towards this very straightforward and simple German ideology based on identity. Nietzsche's last untimely meditation was somewhat critical of Wagner, but as Kaufmann suggests, and I largely agree, the criticism seemed to go over Rickard's head. The real breaking point was Nietzsche's second book, The Final Break. Nietzsche published Human All Too Human in 1878, and it was a deep, challenging look into humankind's metaphysical assumptions and moral judgments. He included a dedication to Voltaire in the first edition. Apparently, that dedication was the thing that prompted Rickard to tell his wife Cosima, upon receiving the copy that Nietzsche sent them, that they would be doing the young Nietzsche a favor by not reading it. In 1879, Nietzsche finally left the university due to his worsening health. His eyesight had become so bad that he had to strain to even read books, which exacerbated his headaches. He was known by this time for carrying a parasol to shield his eyes from the sun. He was given a generous pension, double the normal amount, and with some money from his family, he was able to explore a number of cures for his condition. He visited a number of health clinics. Nothing had a lasting effect, and Nietzsche once again began to feel as though the same fate that claimed his father would soon claim him. 1879 was also the year that Nietzsche reached the same age as his father had been when he died, 36. He had just broken from Wagner, his surrogate father figure. And now the intense feeling that any year could be his last was ever greater. Nietzsche's future always looked very uncertain to him. This was a period of wandering for Nietzsche. He looked for an ideal location to inhabit, where he would find the right conditions that would not exacerbate his headaches and his other symptoms. As he discusses it in Ecce Homo, he looked for the right air pressure, humidity, altitude, and so on. One of the best recorded examples of Nietzsche's feeling that he could be stricken by imminent doom at any time was in 1884, when Nietzsche reported symptoms of what are called visual phosphenes to his friend Ressa Schornhofe. Nietzsche told her that when he closed his eyes, quote, he saw a profusion of fantastic flowers, twining round each other and constantly growing, changing in shape and color with exotic opulence. With disturbing urgency in his soft voice, he asked, "Don't you think this is a symptom of incipient madness?" End quote. And so Nietzsche thought that every year was precious, that every moment he had should be devoted towards some sort of valuable or worthwhile pursuit, some work of greatness. His incredible productivity as a philosopher can likely be attributed to this attitude. From the time when he published Human All Too Human until his last productive year, he had an average output of one book every single year. After the first book of Human All Too Human, he published 2 more volumes in 1880 and 1881, covering nearly every subdiscipline of philosophy, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, politics. Then Daybreak, a scathing attack on moral prejudices and on the exegesis of Christian scripture. Then, a year later, The Gay Science, often considered his first magnum opus, the work that introduces the eternal return and the famous declaration, God is dead. After a handful of years traveling between France, Austria, northern Italy, and Switzerland, Nietzsche eventually settled on Sils Maria as his main place of residence during the 1880s. This picturesque Swiss village up in the Alps is where Nietzsche spent his summers, and where he would write most of his major works. There was only one more temptation that almost brought Nietzsche out of this self-imposed solitude that he'd found. That was his meeting with Paul Rée and Lou Salome. Nietzsche met both of them when he spent some weeks at Malvida von Meisenbug's home in Italy in 1882. Meisenbug's salon in Rome served as a kind of intellectual retreat for thinkers that she invited there, and Nietzsche made fast friends with Ray and Salome. Much has been made of this friendship, mostly based on comments that Salome would make some decades after Nietzsche's collapse and death, that both men were in love with her, and that she refused to marry either one of them. Many have accepted this story uncritically, but there have been serious questions from the very beginning as to whether the story of Nietzsche's infatuation with Lou Salome is genuine. The usual story is that Nietzsche proposed marriage to Salome twice, one time through Paul Ray, and that both times he was rejected, and then Ray and Salome ran off together, and Nietzsche broke with them, never to speak with them ever again. Heinemann offers his own perspective on this relationship, quote, Nietzsche dreamed of a class of friends who were able to free themselves from the trappings of conventional thought and bravely explore the uncharted potential of human resource and creativity. And in 1881, he believed himself to have found such friends. He and his friend Paul Ray met Lou Salome, a captivating woman who seems to have cast a spell over every man she met. And she met her share of greats, including Nietzsche, Freud, Tolstoy, and Rilke. She was intelligent, creative, and daring, just the qualities Nietzsche thought his free spirits must possess. Together they planned to form their own small intellectual commune, combining forces to make actual, a new human possibility of cultural creation. But the triangle self-destructed. Ray and Salome went off together to Berlin, and Nietzsche was left answering priggish and defamatory letters from his mother and sister. End quote. So it is entirely possible that unrequited love was the driving factor in splitting up this group of three friends, but some have offered the alternate explanation that Nietzsche's falling out with the two had more to do with the prying influence of his family, particularly his sister, as well as his sensitivity to rumors that she spread about the three of them. Perhaps there was an intellectual disagreement at the heart of the break, as with Nietzsche and Wagner, or perhaps simply a clash of personalities. We simply do not know, but it's simply worth stating that the standard story of the heartbroken Nietzsche is not rooted in fact, but in hearsay. It's possible, but we simply don't know. Whatever the truth may be, this incident represents Nietzsche's final push into a solitary existence that would define the final years of his productive life. His betrayal and abandonment by his two friends, or however he perceived it, was the final push to devote himself wholeheartedly to his own great work, his magnum opus, without any more worldly obligations, whether it was to the church when he was a boy, or to the university and his students, or to his mentor, or to his friends. Nietzsche had no other calling in life that remained to him except philosophy, and his great work consumed him. The result was Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Now, as we said at the beginning, this was the turning point in Nietzsche's life. His great work is finally completed. He wrote Zarathustra in the style of the New Testament. The central figure is a prophet, but not a prophet that foretells of other worlds or of the will of God, but rather he prophesies the coming of a new type of human being. Zarathustra says that he comes to teach us of the overman, a development of the human species which so fully overcomes the limitations of humanity that it transcends the human. Central to Zarathustra's message is the will to power, a new conception of nature which attacks the Schopenhauerian claim that all life is driven by a will merely to exist, instead of merely living. Instead of a will merely to continue in one's existence, Zarathustra says that the character of life is becoming. Life herself is anthropomorphized into a character over the course of the book, and she says, quote, I am that which overcomes itself, end quote. Zarathustra's first speech to the disinterested people in the marketplace centers on the theme that humankind is therefore a bridge and not a goal. Life is, above all, moving, it is dynamic, it is transformative. This book would eventually become a literary classic in the decades following Nietzsche's death, but at the time of its publication, it received very little attention. Even Nietzsche's friends, who were usually supportive of his work, were somewhat perplexed by the book, which was laden with allegory and symbolism. At many times it verges on poetry and cannot be called a traditional work of philosophy. Jakob Burckhardt, one of the classicists at Basel, whom Nietzsche had befriended, and greatly looked up to when he was there, said that he was terrified by Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Stylistically, Nietzsche had gone to the extreme. He characterized Zarathustra as a Dionysiac monster and the annihilator of morality. And this was a shocking approach that alienated many readers. But this brings us up to where we were when we began the episode, the publication of the first volume of Zarathustra in 1885. After he successfully sued his publisher, Nietzsche was freed from them, and with the money from that settlement, he was able to publish the rest of Zarathustra on his own terms. But as mentioned, Nietzsche was on a fixed income. While his pension was generous, he spent a great deal of that money trying to find cures for his condition, and he lived a Spartan lifestyle. He lived with few, if any, luxuries. Committing some of the money that he had to getting his work properly published is quite easy to understand, given Nietzsche's philosophical calling in life. That was the raison d'etre for his existence at this point. But then why spend the remainder of the money on a new headstone for his father, when his upbringing in Rücken seemed so far from what his life had become by 1885? Heunemann says in Nietzsche's Task that, quote, "We barely have a scrap of evidence for any immediate motive," end quote. We have looked to the details of Nietzsche's biography for an answer, but to fully understand the significance of the headstone, I think we will find the other half of what we need to determine that answer by examining his philosophy. In The Gay Science and in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche puts forward the idea of the eternal recurrence of the same events, the prospect that every event, every decision, every experience, every moment in one's life will repeat in exactly the same manner, in the same sequence, in the same way, over and over again for all eternity. Nietzsche used this idea as a sort of intellectual test. We are to consider how we would feel if it were true. Would we find this idea horrific if we discovered we're doomed to repeat our lives endlessly? Or would we rejoice because your life has been so full and so exciting and so meaningful that it would be a joy to repeat it endlessly? In short, Nietzsche believed that the formula for understanding whether someone was a great person or not, his formula for greatness, he says, is whether or not they could accept their life wholeheartedly. The ultimate embrace of one's life would be the wish for it to repeat forever, to make that life eternal. And so Zarathustra says, accordingly, that all great joy wishes for eternity. And so ultimately, the eternal recurrence is a test of whether or not one truly loves their fate. A person who loves their fate wishes for nothing to be different, not in the past, not in the present. This person wishes only for the fate that they actually possess, the self-same life that they actually have, and doesn't invest value into fantasies of alternate versions of themselves or their lives, or potential better worlds that may exist after death. All of these so-called possible worlds are in fact merely fantasies. Most importantly, the eternal recurrence of the same events is completely unlike the worldview of a garden-variety atheist. The view that this temporary life is all that there is, because if that were the case, one could live an unfulfilling and unhappy life, but console themselves with the thought that their inevitable death is coming as an inevitable end to their suffering. And that was the pessimism of Schopenhauer, who argued that life was redeemed by the negation of the will to live. Salvation was found in one's annihilation upon the complete surrender of the will and actually be going into nothingness. This is not Nietzsche's attitude, and Nietzsche believed that for this life, this world, this existence, to have the same kind of truly eternal value that we had once given to our lives under Christianity, this life would have to be eternal. So eternal recurrence becomes a sort of challenge in one's mind to affirm the world by wishing for its eternality. This is the idea of Nietzschean life affirmation. And we may notice that this is, in some sense, what Nietzsche was looking for his entire life, the justification of this world of suffering, the suffering which Nietzsche himself felt, and the suffering of his father, the untimely death of his father and brother. He rejected the Christian explanation that this suffering would be justified by the world being redeemed at a later time. Nietzsche first sought an alternative answer in Schopenhauer, and then he sought an answer in aesthetics and in the worldview of the Greeks, and he sought an answer in the cultural heroism of Wagner. But what he eventually reaches as what he considers to be the way forward, is the great reevaluation of all values, the affirmation of life that is expressed in Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the eternal recurrence of the same events, and giving that blessing and seal of eternality to all things. We'll look at Heinemann's essay one last time. Quote, "In one letter he mentions the headstone purchased to a friend, and remarks only that he did it to please his mother. But the event must have meant more to him than this. For 36 years his father's death had cast a dark shadow over Nietzsche's life, and for at least 25 years Nietzsche must have feared that he shared the fate of his father. Now he had come to terms with that fate, and had even learned to embrace it. The headstone must have figured, in a way, as a monument to his own embrace of the eternal recurrence. It marked the fact that he would no longer live in fearful expectation of madness and death. The stone said, in effect, 'Here is my father's death, which will also be my own, and I do not hide from it, but raise a monument to it.' And the inscription, 'Love never faileth,' certainly reads like a marvel of Nietzschean double entendre, signifying both Carl Ludwig's belief in the unfailing love of Christ for humanity, and Friedrich Wilhelm's belief in his own unfailing love for the world, his own great and terrible Dionysian yes." End quote. Such a life philosophy, characterized by the term life affirmation, might appear relatively unremarkable or even sedate, had it not been expressed by a man who had lived Nietzsche's life, a life characterized by tragedy, by great suffering, by alienation from those around him, and the eventual flight into solitude. In other words, it would be very different if someone else, say Voltaire, someone who lived a life of relative luxury for his time, defined his philosophy as this act of life affirmation. When we consider what it must have been like to have been afflicted as Nietzsche was, with a sword of Damocles hanging over his head, and no Christian comforts in order to tell himself a consoling story about how it'll all be okay and it'll all be reconciled in the afterlife, demanding for himself only this world, only this self-same life, that is the challenge that he posed for himself, and it appears practically Olympian in nature in light of this. And we could see how this task was with him from even his early days, the seeds of which were contained in his admiration for the Greek tragedies, the desire to affirm the pain of life and apotheosize it into something eternally significant. And thus the headstone, the monument to Nietzsche's father, makes perfect sense in this light. The headstone for Carl Ludwig exemplifies Nietzsche's attitude towards life, never to wish that things could have gone differently, not to fool yourself about who you are, or who someone you loved really was, not to scorn the beliefs and values from which you came. Every single event in the Nietzschean view is necessary. Every factor of one's origin is a part of who you are as a person, and that includes your mother and your father, and your genetics, and your afflictions, and your cultural and religious upbringing, and your nation, and your friends, and everything about you. You can't change these things. And if you could, you would be fundamentally altering who you are. You cannot, therefore, truly love and embrace your life if you condemn your own past, or if you live in a moral condemnation of the conditions that brought you forth. Those things are, at best, simply a recapitulation to a metaphysical longing for some other world to justify this one. At worst, it can be an expression of self-hatred, but as I pointed out before, this idea of possible worlds, alternate timelines, that is a fantasy. That's a metaphysical longing for something outside of this life. Nietzsche transcended all of that. His father was someone that he could celebrate, even as he grew apart from everything that his father and his family stood for. He celebrated his father because his father is a part of him. He cannot wish that he had not been brought forth into the world by this man who had been cursed with this mystery affliction and so much pain, or had set him on this doomed life path of being a theologian or so on and so forth. Nietzsche cannot do any of that, because that would be to wish that he, as he was and as he lived, never existed, right? Nietzsche therefore celebrates even his illness. He celebrates this source of endless suffering as a part of himself. And as we know from Nietzsche's later biography, this illness likely claimed his life. It certainly claimed his sanity for the last 11 years of his existence, and he accepted that. That was an inexorable and separable part of who he was, because without that great suffering, he would not have been Nietzsche. Thank you for joining me, everyone. Amor Fati, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.